All right, so in my first lecture for the unit, I talked a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and how this resulted in this unprecedented era of economic growth, and how during this period we become the largest industrial producer in the world. And in my second lecture, I talked a little bit about how this affects your average American worker, and how even though we have this period of unprecedented economic growth, the changes for the American workforce aren't particularly positive, right? And I used the example of the shoemaking industry and how if you were a shoemaker in the early 1800s, the skills that you had as a shoemaker gave you a certain standard of living. They gave you a certain standing in your community, that you had a lot of freedom and flexibility in terms of the hours that you worked, and how all of this changes as factories become the norm, that you are expected to, instead of building a pair of shoes from start to finish, you are now expected to do one small piece of the shoemaking process, pass it off to the next person, which means that that task that you're doing requires very little skill and can be taught to virtually anyone, which means you no longer have a marketable skill. If you know how to create a pair of shoes, well, the factories that are producing them much quicker and much more cheaply, they don't require those skills for you to go to work in those factories, which means you become replaceable as a worker, which means you don't have much leverage to ask for, say, shorter hours or better working conditions or better wages. So what we're seeing is this period of unprecedented economic growth, but it's being distributed unevenly, right? So the wealthy are accumulating more than ever before in the country's history, but the standard of living for your average American worker is not increasing and is in fact declining. So by 1890, the richest 1% of Americans received the same total income as the bottom half of the population. They owned more property than the remaining 99%. And many of the wealthiest Americans are pursuing this kind of aristocratic lifestyle. And in fact, they're starting to engage in something known as conspicuous consumption, the idea that you don't buy things that you need necessarily or things that you even want necessarily, that spending money can be its own reward, that if you buy something that's really expensive, the value comes from how expensive it is. Spending money for the sake of spending money to show everyone how wealthy you are kind of comes into fashion during this time. And because this is a period where the standard of living for your average American worker is decreasing, this highly visible displaying of your wealth really increases tensions in the country. So there's these class divisions, there's a disparity between the poor and the wealthy, and they become more apparent to your average American. And this increases anger and division. And out of this, we see the birth of the labor movement in this country. And the labor movement is just founded on the idea that if you as a worker don't have much power to ask for a better standard of living, right? If you go in and ask your boss for a raise, and your boss has no incentive to do that because there's not much skill set required to do your job, and because there's this steady influx of labor from the rapid population growth that's happening, if they can very easily just replace you, you don't have much power. But if every worker in that factory all walks out at the same time, this is a powerful thing. And employers will be forced to listen if their entire labor force is demanding something. And so the idea is that many are strong while one is weak. It's the idea of collective bargaining, getting together and asking all at the same time for certain demands. Now, the first, I would say, notable labor dispute in this country is the Great Strike of 1877, and it starts in Martinsburg, West Virginia on July 14th, 1877. And the reason it starts is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, one of the largest railroad companies in the country. They cut their wages for the third time in a single year. So they basically, at a time when their profits are soaring, are not only keeping workers' wages the exact same, they're actually pushing them down. 3 times in 1 year they cut wages. And as a result, strikes start to break out in cities across the country. Martinsburg, West Virginia is the first one. And what happens, workers walk off the job in protest. They prevent about 600 trains from moving. The governor of the state calls out the state militia, which is basically the state's kind of armed forces. But the militiamen come out there, they see friends and relatives among the strikers, and basically they refuse to take action. So federal troops get called in, and they disperse the protesters, and they do this by violence. But this is really just the beginning of it. So Martinsburg, West Virginia, this strike gets put down by force, but within a week, railroad workers in Pittsburgh are going on strike. They're preventing the movement of all trains. Fires start to break out. They destroy about 500 freight cars, 100 locomotives, 39 buildings get burned to the ground. And the state militia, again, when they come out, they're sympathetic to the strikers. So federal troops once again have to be called in. Then it spreads to New York, to St. Louis, Missouri, to Chicago, Illinois. Even makes it as far west as San Francisco, and workers across the city start burning down and destroying physical facilities, railroad cars, buildings. Riots break out in the streets in several cities. And this strike lasts about 45 days, and local populations that are seeing this are just freaking out. They think they're seeing the start of a revolution of the working class. The violent overthrow of the industrial capitalist system. And this is scary for a lot of people. So I mentioned that those local and state militias were pretty reluctant initially, but in some places they do start to step in and put the strikes down by force. But more often than not, it was federal troops coming in and putting down these strikes violently. And so we see all of these really horrific scenes play out across the country. People losing their lives, and ultimately at the end of this, about 10,000 workers participate. About 100 people lose their lives, 100 people are killed in the unrest that results from these strikes, and about 1,000 people are thrown in jail. Now, the thing to note about this is the Great Strike of 1877 was a failure in the sense that workers did not receive any better working conditions, right? That this was a violent strike. It didn't really increase sympathy for the workforce. They didn't receive any notable gains. But it's interesting because it's the first major national strike. Workers had walked off the job in large numbers in many cases before this, but it had always been in a single city. And so once that strike was over, the strike was over. Here what we see is protesting expanding outwards, right? I talked about how the economy was becoming increasingly national. Products could make it all the way across the country for the first time pretty easily. Well, as we have an increasingly national economy, we also have an increasingly national economy of ideas. The information about what's happening in the country starts to spread more rapidly. So events in Martinsburg, West Virginia can spread to Chicago, Illinois, to New York pretty easily. And this is really facilitated in this case because this is a strike of railroad workers. Traveling is part of the job description. So workers seeing what's happening in West Virginia are then going out to other parts of the country, telling the workers what is happening. And this is what really kind of facilitates this becoming a national labor strike. And this really served as a signal to the people in charge of the country, to factory owners, that these labor disputes were no longer going to be local phenomena. That in an increasingly national economy, disputes between workers and factory owners were going to become increasingly national. And one of the people that sees this and tries to learn the lessons of the strike of 1877 is a guy named Samuel Gompers, and he helps form the American Federation of Labor. This is the first major national labor union. Now, in terms of what the AFL does, they are an alliance of small craft unions, meaning only skilled laborers from specific industries. So, for instance, carpenters or cigar makers or this sort of thing. It's really kind of just a banding together of these small, localized craft unions under a national umbrella organization. So it's kind of limited in what it wanted to do. It wanted to focus in on voluntary agreements between employers and their workers. So it did not go as far as future labor movements that tried to lobby on behalf of workers to Congress and get laws passed protecting workers' rights. Samuel Gompers felt that this was ill-advised. He thought laws can easily be changed as political winds change, and so they weren't seen as very permanent. But if you could display your strength as workers and present a united front, you could enter into voluntary agreements with your bosses who would be more likely to stick to those agreements once they were made. He also very strongly opposed women entering the workforce. One of the things that he said is that if women are working, that employers are going to be more inclined to pay them less, which drives down wages for all workers. So he advocated that women should not work. But for the women that were in the workforce, he did also fight for equal pay for them. And his reasoning for this was not necessarily because he supported women. His reasoning was that if women were paid the same as men, that employers would be less likely to hire them. And so he thought by advocating on behalf of women workers, he could force women out of the workforce entirely. So Samuel Gompers is kind of this moderate force in the American labor movement. And there's limits to where he plans on going. But he sets an example for national organizing, and following his example, we see other labor unions spring up that ask for much, much more in terms of what they're hoping for. And one example of this is the Industrial Workers of the World. They're far more radical than the AFL. In fact, they sought to overthrow the entire industrial capitalist system. They wanted to seize the means of production and put them in the hands of workers. In other words, communism, right? Their ideas were seen as so dangerous, and this is their major contribution, is that the AFL and the things that they're asking for, these voluntary agreements between factory owners and workers, this seems much more reasonable by comparison to that other labor union that's asking for the violent overthrow of the entire industrial capitalist system. So we start to see labor growing in strength in the second half of the 1800s. But despite this, there's really very little in the way of concrete gains. And in fact, wages are rising slower than the cost of living. The few legislative victories that we have, laws that get passed to protect workers' rights, they don't get enforced. Strikes and protests are really ineffective, and in fact, the federal government, in most cases, don't support workers, and in some cases, steps in and puts down these strikes violently. And part of the reason for this is only about 4% of the labor force is unionized as of 1900, which means you don't have that same strength. If 100% of your workers are walking off, well, if you're a factory owner, you're going to listen to that. But if 4% walks off, and they can easily be replaced, well, you're going to be less willing to do that. And the AFL was reluctant to support unskilled labor. Unskilled labor was the vast majority of the workforce, right? So the biggest labor union in the country is not admitting most of the workers. We also had a large percentage of the workforce that were immigrants, and they were less likely to get involved in unions for a variety of reasons. But the primary one was a lot of them saw themselves as coming over to earn money to send back home and didn't see America necessarily as their permanent home. So why are they going to get involved and expose themselves to risk when they don't see themselves as building a life here necessarily? And also the shift between industries, right? The fact that if you get fired from one job, you may work in a shoemaking factory 1 week, get fired, and a month later you're working in a steel factory. This shifting of workers between industries doesn't give the ability to build up the organizational capacity of labor in the same way that it would later.